The sun had just set behind the endless fields on the outskirts of Oklahoma City, leaving a vibrant streak of orange blended with purple across the sky. The cool March evening air carried the faint scent of dry grass from afar, mingling with the sweet aroma of cotton candy and the sizzling smell of grilling meat wafting from the fairground stalls. The Oklahoma County Fair this year was the biggest event in months, a rare occasion for folks from nearby small towns to gather, setting aside the long days of labor in the fields or auto shops. Strings of round light bulbs dangled from wires stretched between the stalls, flickering to life like stars fallen to earth, illuminating a vast patch of land that typically lay shrouded in quiet darkness. The crowd buzzed with energy, laughter echoing through the air. Children darted about, clutching colorful balloons, while mothers tugged them close to wipe smears of ice cream from their cheeks. Young men in checkered shirts clustered around the ring toss game, trying to impress giggling girls nearby. A crackling loudspeaker blared from the carousel area, where an old country tune played, drowning out the rumbling engine of a delivery truck parked at the fair's edge. The scent of frying oil from the funnel cake stand mixed with the spicy smoke of a beef barbecue, creating a distinctive aroma unique to rural fairs like this. In the middle of the field, a makeshift stage hosted a local band strumming cheerful melodies, coaxing a few awkward couples to dance on the hard-packed dirt. A bit further off, near a weathered wooden fence marking the boundary between the fair and the wild fields beyond, stood the amateur wrestling ring, a small but ever-popular corner. The ring was fashioned from wooden planks topped with a thin layer of sand to cushion falls, surrounded by a few rows of rickety chairs for spectators. Tonight, the area wasn't yet crowded, just a handful of men lingering around, beers in hand, chatting about an upcoming match between two local boys. They laughed and placed small bets, the mood still light and easy, much like the rest of the fair. But that was about to change. From the main entrance of the fair, a towering figure emerged, striding forward with an almost insolent confidence. Frank Bullock, the chief deputy of a nearby small town, stood out in the crowd like a mountain amid a plain. He was over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as a blacksmith's, muscles bulging beneath a crisp, dark blue police uniform. A silver badge gleamed on his chest under the lights, and each step made his polished black boots thud against the dry ground. His short blonde hair peeked out from under his police cap, and his cold blue eyes scanned the crowd as if searching for a criminal to punish. In his right hand, he held a police baton, tapping it lightly against his left palm in a steady rhythm, a silent warning to all. Frank wasn't here to enjoy the festivities. He was here to assert his presence. In the little town he ruled, Frank Bullock's name was synonymous with power, a power forged from swinging his baton to subdue drunks outside the bar, from punches that left thieves weeping for mercy, and from a steely gaze that made anyone lower their head. He was proud of it, proud to the point of arrogance. And tonight at this fair, Frank wanted the entire Oklahoma County to know that no one at all, could outmatch him, whether in his line of duty or on the wrestling ring. As Frank approached the wrestling area, the crowd began to notice. Laughter quieted, replaced by whispers rippling through like a wave. "That's Bullock," an older man in a denim jacket muttered to his friend, pointing toward the deputy. "Heard he once took down 3 robbers with his bare hands." His companion nodded, though his eyes betrayed unease. "Yeah, but he doesn't go easy on anyone. Just last week, he beat a guy outside the bar for talking back." The murmurs spread quickly, carrying a mix of awe and fear. Children stopped running, clinging to their parents' legs, while a few men near the ring stepped back, sensing something brewing. Frank halted before the wrestling ring, his eyes sweeping over the crowd with a sneer. He removed his police cap, setting it on a nearby chair, then stepped onto the ring without hesitation. The wood creaked under his weight, dust swirling around his boots. 2 young men preparing to wrestle, a skinny one with tousled hair and a shorter, stocky one, froze, staring at Frank with a mix of surprise and worry. "Get out," Frank said, his deep, cold voice cutting through the small space. "Tonight, this ring is mine." No one dared argue. The 2 youths slunk off, one muttering something but falling silent under Frank's sharp glance. He stood in the center of the ring, hands on hips, chest puffed out like a living statue. The crowd edged closer, curiosity mingling with tension. Frank Bullock in the wrestling ring wasn't a common sight, and everyone knew he wasn't here just to watch others fight. "Listen up!" Frank bellowed, his voice drowning out the distant music from the stage. "I'm Frank Bullock, the law around these parts. I've crushed every criminal from here to Tulsa, and no one's dared look me in the eye. Tonight, I'm standing here to see if anyone's got the guts to step into this ring with me. If you think you're tougher than a real lawman, come prove it. But I'll warn you now, I don't know how to lose." His words hit the air like a punch, bold and defiant. The crowd fell silent, a few exchanging glances, but no one moved. A burly man nearby, likely a carpenter by his build, gripped his beer can as if about to step forward, but he backed off when Frank locked eyes with him. "What? No one?" Frank smirked, his dry laugh breaking the stillness. "I figured. You lot are only good for mouthing off at the bar. But here in front of me, you've got nothing." He began pacing the ring, each step a heavy thud on the wood, amplifying his presence. The baton was now gripped firmly in his hand, occasionally swinging through the air as if reenacting an arrest. "I broke a horse thief's jaw with this once," he said, holding it up. "Another time, I pinned a moonshine runner to the ground before he could draw a knife. The law is me, and I'm the strongest here. If you don't believe it, step up and prove me wrong." The fair's atmosphere around the wrestling ring grew heavy. Laughter from distant stalls still drifted over, but here, everything seemed frozen. A few women pulled their children away, unwilling to let them witness whatever might unfold. The remaining men stood still, clutching beers or popcorn bags, their eyes flickering between curiosity and dread. Frank Bullock wasn't just a deputy. He was a living threat, wielding both physical strength and professional authority to dominate everything around him. But in the crowd, a few eyes began to drift toward the fair's entrance, still aglow with lights. Something was shifting, though Frank hadn't noticed. He stood there, proud and defiant in the ring, waiting for a challenger no one dared to be. The country music from the stage faded, giving way to an odd silence, as if the entire fair held its breath. And then, from the shadows of the field beyond, another figure began to emerge, slowly, calmly, but carrying an undeniable pull. The air at the amateur wrestling ring of the Oklahoma County Fair grew stifling, despite the cool March night and the faint breeze blowing in from the distant fields. Frank Bullock still stood in the center of the ring, his polished black boots leaving marks in the thin layer of sand, his police baton twirling lightly in his right hand like a toy. He'd just issued his final challenge, his deep voice booming over the silent crowd. "No one's got the guts? Then I'm the strongest here, as always." A smug grin curled his lips, his cold blue eyes scanning each face in the crowd, as if daring them to flinch. The country music from the far-off stage was now a faint murmur, overwhelmed by the deputy's imposing presence. The crowd remained still. A few men lowered their heads, avoiding Frank's gaze, their hands crushing beer cans until the aluminum crumpled. Others whispered so softly it was barely audible, as if afraid a louder sound might draw his attention. A young mother, clutching her small child, murmured to her husband, "Let's go, honey. This isn't fun anymore." But he shook his head, eyes fixed on the ring, more curious than afraid. No one stepped forward. No one dared test the self-proclaimed unbeatable deputy. Frank knew it, and he savored every second of their trembling silence. But then, from the fair's edge, where the lights dimmed and the darkness of the wild fields took over, a figure appeared. Slowly, almost silently, he stepped through the main entrance, his dusty cowboy boots tapping lightly on the hard ground. The crowd didn't notice at first, but a few curious glances turned that way, drawn by something inexplicable. Frank, still in the ring, hadn't sensed the shift. Facing away from the entrance, he continued his boasts. "I once pinned a guy twice my size with one hand. The law around here is me, and no one's changing that." The figure drew closer, parting the crowd as he advanced. The stall lights caught him, a man not as towering as Frank, but wiry and solid, with broad shoulders and a steady gait that spoke of familiarity with rough terrain. He wore a faded denim shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing tanned, scarred arms, marks of battles no one knew. Worn jeans hugged his sturdy legs, and a cowboy hat sat tilted on his head, shadowing part of his face. But when he looked up, the light hit his deep brown eyes, calm and piercing, and the crowd began to recognize him. Whispers spread like wildfire across dry grass. "Chuck Norris," a man near the ring blurted, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "No way." His friend elbowed him, whispering, "It's him, all right. Look at how he moves. No one could fake that." The murmurs grew, passing from one person to the next like an unstoppable wave. Children craned their necks, wide-eyed, while adults pointed, their voices tinged with excitement and fear. Chuck Norris, the name tied to Oklahoma legends and beyond, was here, at this fair, heading straight for the wrestling ring. Frank finally caught on. The crowd's whispers made him turn, his eyes narrowing as he peered toward the entrance. He saw Chuck, but didn't flinch. To Frank, the name Chuck Norris was just an overhyped tale, a story rural folks spun to scare kids or brag about in bars. He smirked, his dry laugh cutting through the quiet. "Well, look who we've got here," he said, dripping with mockery. "The old cowboy from the legends? I thought you were just a bedtime story for brats." Chuck didn't respond. He stopped a few paces from the ring, his boots leaving faint dust trails on the ground. The crowd parted instinctively, forming a clear path from him to Frank. He stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, his calm gaze fixed on the deputy above. There was no challenge, no arrogance, just a quiet presence that made the air around the wrestling ring heavier than ever. The wind from the fields seemed to still, yielding to the tense silence. Frank stepped to the ring's edge, leaning down to eye Chuck, hands on hips to flaunt his massive frame. "Heard you took down a dozen guys at once, huh?" he taunted. "But I don't buy that hogwash. Around here, I'm the strongest, and I ain't scared of some old-timer playing hero." He tapped his baton against his palm, the sharp sound ringing out like a war drum. "So, Norris, you stepping up or just gonna stand there posing?" The crowd held its breath. A few edged back, as if proximity alone might bring trouble. But Chuck didn't budge. He lifted his head slowly, locking eyes with Frank, unwavering. It wasn't a look of anger or defiance, but one that saw through everything, as if he'd already glimpsed the outcome. Then, with a gentle motion, he removed his cowboy hat and handed it to a boy nearby. "Hold this for me, kid," he said, his low voice steady and unhurried. The boy took the hat, eyes wide, nodding eagerly as if entrusted with a sacred task. Chuck turned back, stepping onto the ring, each footfall creaking the wood beneath him. The crowd erupted in louder whispers, some shouting, "He's going up!" But Frank didn't waver. He laughed, the sound booming over the noise. "All right, old man," he said, stepping back to make room. "I'll give you a shot. But don't blame me when you're crawling out of here. One punch, and I'll show this crowd who the real tough guy is." Chuck stopped in the ring's center, a few feet from Frank. He stood straight, hands still loose, unguarded. The distant stall lights lit his rugged face, highlighting his deep brown eyes, devoid of emotion. Frank, meanwhile, began to move, his boots thudding on the wood as he paced, muscles flexing under his uniform. He raised his baton, then tossed it aside, the clatter sharp as it hit the ground. "Don't need this," he said, clenching his fists. "Bare hands are enough to teach you a lesson." The tension was palpable, thick enough to slice. The crowd pressed closer to the ring, some covering their mouths, eyes glued to the two men. An old man in the back whispered to his neighbor, "I saw Chuck knock out a bull with one kick once. Bullock doesn't know what he's up against." His friend nodded, silent, staring ahead. Frank charged, his steps shaking the ring. "Get ready to fall, Norris," he roared, swinging a punch straight at Chuck, his fist powered by the full might of a deputy used to crushing foes. The crowd gasped, some shutting their eyes. But Chuck stood still, his gaze fixed on Frank, as if it were all a slow game in his mind. The amateur wrestling ring at the Oklahoma County Fair trembled under Frank Bullock's weight as he charged, his polished black boots slamming into the sand-dusted wood. His punch shot forward, a perfect line aimed at Chuck Norris's face, fueled by the strength of a deputy accustomed to overpowering every opponent bare-handed. The crowd held its breath, a few cries erupting then dying instantly, swallowed by the taut air. The stall lights caught Frank's fist, illuminating the taut veins beneath his tanned skin, and for that split second, it seemed no one doubted this blow would end it all. Frank was confident, too confident, his cold blue eyes gleaming with certainty. He could already see Chuck sprawled out, the crowd stunned, his reputation cemented once more. But then, it happened so fast no one could process it. A dull thud rang out, dust billowing around the ring, and Frank Bullock, the towering, arrogant deputy, was flat on his back, limbs splayed like a discarded doll. The crowd went silent for a beat, then exploded in gasps and murmurs, some shouting, "What just happened?" No one saw Chuck move. He stood there, dead center in the ring, his dusty cowboy boots unmoved, hands relaxed at his sides, face unchanged. His deep brown eyes remained calm, as if nothing noteworthy had occurred. No sweat, no crease in his faded denim shirt. Frank lay there, chest heaving, ragged breaths escaping his parted lips. Confusion gripped him, his wide eyes staring at the night sky, struggling to grasp what had transpired. His punch, the one he was sure would fell anyone, hadn't touched Chuck, or at least he hadn't felt it land. A sharp pain radiated from his shoulder to his chest, as if his own force had turned against him, but his mind was blank, unable to make sense of it. His police uniform, always pristine and commanding, was now disheveled, the shirt untucked, the silver badge tilting askew. He pressed a hand to the floor, trying to rise, but his trembling arms failed him, sending him sliding back down, dust caking his flushed face in humiliation. The crowd reacted. A burly man, likely a blacksmith by his build, let out a booming laugh that echoed through the stillness. "Look at that, the unbeatable deputy!" he yelled, pointing at Frank. Others joined in, laughter spreading, mingling with unfiltered chatter. "He didn't even see what hit him," a young mother said to her husband, clutching her awestruck child. "Told you, no one beats Chuck Norris," an old man in the back muttered, his voice proud as if he'd proven it himself. Chuck said nothing. He stood still, the lights casting over his rugged face, his gaze sweeping the crowd before settling on Frank. There was no mockery, no triumph, just a cold look, as if he'd seen this play out 100 times. Frank finally managed to sit up, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain and shame. He stared at Chuck, his eyes no longer icy but wild, almost pleading for an explanation. What did you do to me?" he stammered, voice hoarse, stripped of the deputy's former bravado. Chuck didn't answer immediately. He stepped across the ring, his boots tapping steadily, each sound a blow to Frank's shattered pride. He paused at the edge, turning back to the deputy kneeling on the wood. "I didn't do anything," Chuck said, his low voice even and emotionless. "You fell on your own." The words were brief but cutting, slicing into Frank's arrogance. The crowd erupted in laughter again, some clapping as if they'd just watched a brilliant comedy. Frank gritted his teeth, struggling to stand, but his legs shook, forcing him to grip the ring's edge for balance. He looked down at his dust-covered boots, then up at Chuck, his eyes now a mix of anger and fear. He didn't understand, nobody did, what had happened. One moment he was the strongest, the invincible deputy of Oklahoma, feared by every crook. Now he was a fool, floored before hundreds without knowing why. His baton lay forgotten near the ring's edge, as abandoned as his reputation. The crowd wouldn't stop talking. The boy who'd held Chuck's hat shouted, "Uncle Chuck beat him without lifting a hand." People around laughed, nodding, though no one had seen Chuck strike. Some began whispering old tales of Chuck Norris, that he'd once broken a wild horse's leg with a single kick, that he could take down an army without breaking a sweat. The stories Frank had mocked as fiction now stood as vivid truth before their eyes. Frank finally stood, but he no longer resembled the proud deputy. His shoulders slumped, his uniform sleeve torn at the elbow, his blonde hair a dusty mess. He glanced at the crowd, their once respectful faces now mocking and curious. A man near the ring yelled, "Hey Bullock, pick your fights better next time." Laughter rang out again, a final hammer to his dignity. Chuck turned away, stepping off the ring without haste. The crowd parted for him, their eyes now fixed on the man in the faded denim shirt rather than Frank. He walked to the nearby beer stand, where a stout vendor stood gaping at the scene. "One beer," Chuck said, his voice steady as if he'd just taken a stroll. The vendor fumbled, spilling foam as he poured, then slid the glass over without charging, hands trembling. Chuck took the beer, sipped slowly, then glanced back at Frank one last time. The deputy stood frozen, clutching his shoulder, eyes vacant. "You picked the fight," Chuck said, his low voice carrying over the crowd's noise, "but it didn't go how you thought. Choose your next one wiser." The words were calm but heavy, making Frank bow his head, unable to look up. The crowd burst into applause, some whistling, others shouting, "Chuck Norris," as if hailing a hero. Frank was no longer the focus. He stepped off the ring silently, picking up his baton with shaking hands, then turned and walked away from the wrestling area. No one stopped him, but curious stares and stifled laughs followed, a shadow of shame he couldn't shake. Chuck took another sip, set the glass down, and walked out of the fair's lights, back into the field's darkness. He didn't need to say more. His actions had spoken. On the ring, Frank's boot prints remained, but they were now just a mark of arrogance that had crumbled. The lights of the Oklahoma County Fair stalls still twinkled in the night, but the mood at the wrestling ring had shifted entirely. Laughter, applause, and lively chatter filled the space once dominated by Frank Bullock's arrogance. The towering deputy who'd stood in the ring like an unassailable peak was gone, his heavy steps dragging across the dry ground as he left. His police baton dangled uselessly in his hand, no longer tapping out its sharp, authoritative rhythm. The crowd no longer watched him with awe or fear. Only mockery, curiosity, and a hint of pity remained. Frank didn't look back. He passed the glowing stalls where kids still chased balloons, where couples laughed by game booths, but it all felt alien to him. The cheerful country music from the distant stage drifted over, carefree and light, but to Frank it was a final taunt, echoing in his mind alongside the crowd's laughter. His shoulders slumped, his once crisp police uniform now rumpled, the shirt untucked, the silver badge tilting as if about to fall. Dust streaked his flushed face, but he didn't wipe it away. His cold blue eyes, once a terror to criminals, were hollow, dodging every curious glance trailing him from afar. He stopped near the fair's edge, where the lights faded and the wild field's darkness took over. Leaning a hand against a rotting wooden fence, Frank panted as if he'd run a mile. He clutched his shoulder, the dull ache from his inexplicable fall still throbbing, and muttered to himself, "What happened? I can't lose. Not like that." But the words stayed in his head, feeble and meaningless, unable to dispel the stark truth. He'd lost, humiliatingly, before hundreds, to a man he'd mocked as an old cowboy from legends. Back at the wrestling area, the excitement lingered. Chuck Norris, who'd floored Frank without anyone seeing him move, had left the ring, but his presence lingered in everyone's minds. He stood by the beer stand, a cold glass in hand, sipping as his calm eyes scanned the crowd gathering around him. No one dared get too close, but their gazes, from kids to adults, shone with reverence and awe. The boy who'd held Chuck's hat, now wearing it proudly, ran around the stand yelling, "Uncle Chuck's the strongest! I saw it all!" The crowd laughed, some clapping, as if the kid had voiced what they all thought but wouldn't say. The beer vendor, a hefty man in a greasy apron, still hadn't recovered. He poured another glass, sliding it to Chuck without charging, muttering, "Never seen anything like it. He fell, and you didn't even touch him. That's Chuck Norris, all right." Chuck nodded slightly, silent, sipping again before setting the glass down. He didn't need to explain. His actions had said enough. His final words to Frank, "You picked the fight, but it didn't go how you thought. Choose your next one wiser," echoed in the minds of those who'd heard, a succinct but sharp proverb. The crowd began to disperse, but the tale of that brief fight didn't fade. Men clustered around the beer stand, beers in hand, retelling the event with details growing wilder by the word. "I swear Chuck just looked at him, and he dropped," the burly blacksmith said, voice buzzing with thrill. No, I saw his hand twitch, so fast no one caught it," another countered, mimicking an imagined move. An old man on a wooden chair nearby, leaning on his cane, cut in, "Told you. I saw Chuck kick a wild bull's leg clean off once. Bullock was nothing." Kids joined in too. A group near the carousel reenacted the scene, the tallest playing Frank, shouting, "I'm the strongest," before flopping to the ground, while the smallest, in a straw hat mimicking Chuck's, stood still and declared, "I'm Chuck Norris." Laughter rang out, drawing amused looks from nearby parents. The story of Frank Bullock and Chuck Norris spread fast, from stall to stall, mouth to mouth, like fire across dry grass. Meanwhile, Frank had left the fair. He stepped into the wild field, beyond the reach of the lights, his tall frame sinking into the dark. The fair's sounds, music, laughter, chatter, still drifted from afar, but to him, they were a bitter reminder of his defeat. He paused by an old oak, slamming his fist into the trunk with a dry thud. Bark chipped off, bits falling to the ground, but the punch didn't ease him. Pain shot from his shoulder to his arm, and he sank to the grass, head bowed, hands covering his face. He recalled his glory days in his small town. He'd been the deputy everyone respected, the one thieves feared, the one whose mere presence quelled trouble. He'd broken a horse thief's jaw, pinned a moonshine runner to the ground before a crowd, stood in the bar with his baton and roared, "Who dares defy me?" No one did. But now it was gone, shattered in a fleeting moment he couldn't fathom. Chuck Norris, the name he'd scoffed at, had taken it all. His reputation, his confidence, his belief he was the strongest. He sat there in the dark for a long time. The March night wind blew cold, but he felt nothing but emptiness. He knew he couldn't return to the fair, couldn't face the mocking eyes, the whispers behind his back. He stood, walking deeper into the field, aimless, just wanting to escape. His baton slipped from his hand unnoticed, left on the grass like a discarded memory. At the fair, Chuck had left the beer stand. He retrieved his hat from the boy, tipping it back on with a slight nod of thanks, then stepped out of the lights, back into the field's darkness. The crowd watched, some calling, "Chuck, come back!" But he didn't turn. His steps were steady, his boots leaving faint dust trails, and soon he vanished into the night, like a phantom who came and went without a trace, save for the story now spreading across Oklahoma. Days later, the fair ended, but the tale of Frank Bullock and Chuck Norris didn't die. In bars, on fields, at family gatherings, people recounted that fight in countless versions. Frank became a cautionary tale, a braggart who challenged Chuck Norris and paid with his reputation. "Don't pull a Bullock," they'd say, because out there, Chuck Norris is waiting and no one beats him. Chuck's name, already legendary, grew stronger, not just in Oklahoma, but beyond, an untouchable icon. Frank never returned to the county fair. He stayed a deputy in his small town, but no one saw him the same. When he appeared, some whispered, some snickered, and he knew what they said. He avoided their eyes, the mentions of that fateful night, but he couldn't escape Chuck Norris's shadow, the man no one in Oklahoma, badge or not, dared underestimate again.